Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for another discography ranking. And today it's another multi-part series. We are going to be looking at, today, the discography of folk music's very own Simon and Garfunkel. The Simon and Garfunkel story is pretty well known. There's not a whole lot of need, I don't think, to go into who they were. Two massive figures in the history of folk music, old school friends who came together, made some recordings early on as a duo under the name Tom and Jerry, ended up signing with Columbia Records and putting out an album in 1964, which flopped. And I think it's worth noting, too, that they signed with Columbia Records in 64, and they put out this record, and this was right during the era when Bob Dylan was massive and selling tons of records and bringing back this whole folk revival movement with Columbia. So the fact that Simon and Garfunkel's debut sold poorly is actually something that is pretty impressive, I guess, in a negative context. But they end up sort of having a revitalization after that point, with The Sound of Silence becoming a massive hit on college radio and that sort of thing. And from then on, the band became one of the most prominent acts of the late 1960s before interpersonal disagreements split the duo up after 5 records in 1970. And that, too, I think, is part of the appeal of Simon and Garfunkel, this sort of lightning in a bottle, short brevity to their career, and all the questions about what if they had stayed together to continue making music. Now, they did reunite on a number of occasions for concerts, either one-off concerts or concert tours, the most recent being in 2010, where they did a tour at that point. However, the interpersonal disagreements between the two, which are always messy in the way that interpersonal arguments are and aren't worth delving into for the sake of this video, all that meant that essentially the two of them never reunited to record a full-length record, and the one time that it did, it ended really poorly, but we'll save that for the Paul Simon video. So there are 5 studio albums, as I said, that we are going to be talking about in this video. Now, there is one live album that is worth acknowledging, 1981's The Concert in Central Park, and 1982's The Concert in Central Park, excuse me. This was a release of the first reunion show that they had played together. The two had already reunited for a studio track a few years prior, My Little Town, but this was a massive deal, a concert with a lot of hype that was built up to it, something that both members were nervous about. I think Garfunkel especially was very nervous about how it would go on. But it was a massive success, and the live record itself is really good. Definitely sounds a little bit of its time, I think, in the sense that it very much sounds like Simon and Garfunkel playing their songs in the late 1970s, early 1980s with some of the keyboards that they've added and that sort of thing. But it's really strong. Their vocal blend live is still extremely sharp. Voices don't sound like they've aged a day in the 10 years since they've recorded together. And certainly, I think, as a postscript to their career, it is an essential listen in that sense. So highly worth checking out for sure. I'm also not going to be including the 1968 Graduate soundtrack, just for the simple fact that all these songs are covered in other records on some level, and some of these were previously released songs. It doesn't really fit neatly into the canon, so to speak, so there's not much point in including it in this ranking. But with that said, we have 5 albums to get to, so let's go ahead and get on in. At number 5, and this should not be too much of a surprise to people, although it is for me, at least considering my history with this group, I have the debut record, 1964's Wednesday Morning 3 a.m. Most people have this at the bottom, and it's understandable why. However, this wasn't always mine. I've actually been very partial to this record over the years, and I think despite the aforementioned poor sales of it, I think it's actually a very strong folk record for the time. It's definitely, as I said, I think the comments you can make about it are that it is a very formative record, and a record that I think represents untapped potential in some ways more than fully realized potential. You do have the original songs on here, several original songs from Paul Simon himself, and a lot of them are really strong and really amazing right off the bat. But you also have a mixture of covers. And I do tend to think that the covers on the record are overall fine, but they don't necessarily add to things a ton. Last night I had The Strangest Dream, Go Tell It on the Mountain, the sort of required Dylan cover, The Times They Are a Changin'. All of these examples of recordings that I think are perfectly fine, and they work well for what they are doing, but they don't really scratch the itch that you know this duo is capable of. It just sounds it's well executed, and it doesn't really transcend that for me personally. And I think in all these cases, I think there are superior versions out there. But I do think that the original tracks on here from Paul Simon himself are really the reasons to go to the record. Bleecker Street, one of the most underrated Simon and Garfunkel songs in general, I think. I really love the interweaving vocal lines that they do here, and they do it on several other tracks as well. The Simon and Garfunkel vocal approach is very much cribbed, kind of taken from the Everly Brothers. And the thing is, and I do not besmirch the Everly Brothers' name in any particular way, because I think they were fantastic harmony singers, but give me Simon and Garfunkel every day because of moments like this. As far as I'm aware, the Everlys are not a duo that do a lot of interweaving vocal lines where one's singing a lower harmony and then jumps up to the high harmony mid-song. But Simon and Garfunkel do that a lot on this record. Not as much later on, but here they do it a lot. And that is really difficult. That is extremely difficult to do, because it's a lot more difficult to keep track of your relation to the other person from a pitch standpoint, and it makes it more difficult to stay on pitch as a result. Very difficult. Bleecker Street, one of the best examples of that. Superb song. He Was My Brother is another great underrated track. Some really dynamic vocals and dynamic guitar parts on here, which are really cool. And the closing track, Wednesday Morning, 3 a.m., the title track, is really nice too. As far as The Sound of Silence goes, which is on here, of course, the acoustic version has always been my favorite. It's the original version. It's the most organic version. The electric version, I can hear the production tricks that they do to the electric version too audibly, and it sounds too sloppy for me to call it my favorite. And the thing is, everyone talks about The Sound of Silence, and it is a transcendently good song. And for as much as I think it is one of Paul Simon's best tracks of his career, a very storied career as we will get to, it fits pretty nicely here with everything else. And I don't think it quite casts the shadow over everything else that some people think it does. Sonically, dynamic-wise, it fits in pretty snugly. It just happens to be the best song on this record, but you don't feel disappointed walking away from the rest of it. At least I don't. So, again, definitely a record that shows potential more than anything else, but definitely, I think, realized to a point. Still a really enjoyable listen, still a very strong folk record for the era, and while it's my bottom, technically speaking, Simon and Garfunkel are one of my favorite duos of all time. Really important act for me musically. So it's only going to get better and better from here. Even the worst is still pretty freaking good. At number 4, and this is my quote-unquote controversial Simon and Garfunkel opinion. I have had it for as long as I have loved the group, and it used to be my bottom. It has changed, but still not quite as strong for me as some of the others. I do have 1968's Bookends here. As I said, I've never been quite as keen on Bookends as some of the other records in their catalog. It's still superb in many respects, and I admire what it's trying to do. My issue comes down to, I guess, how satisfied I am with the execution of things. So, Bookends is a partial concept record in the sense that the first side is meant to be this sort of conceptual piece about life, about growing up and aging, and eventually, growing into kind of elderly years, passing away, that sort of thing. And they kind of handle it in a very abstract way, which is cool. And I like the idea here. And it starts off really strong with the instrumental interlude into Save the Life of My Child, which has no parallel to any other Simon and Garfunkel track released before it. It is bombastic. Has this very loud kind of synth part going on here. It's very strange, but I appreciate the kind of oddball nature of it. Again, it stands apart in the Simon and Garfunkel catalog a lot. And then America right after it is, again, one of the best Simon and Garfunkel songs, I think. Just a beautiful arrangement, lovely lyrics, and again, the dynamics and how the song kind of builds up and falls down to kind of quietness and then builds up at the end to that climax is really terrific. Fantastic opening punch here. It fades a bit for me after that. I like most of the other stuff. I like Old Friends quite a bit, actually. But I think having Old Friends right after Voices of Old People, which is, again, I think one of the Simon and Garfunkel record tracks that just does not really click outside of the context of the record. It feels like, when you're doing this whole theme on the side of an album and you have like 15 minutes to cover this whole theme, having back-to-back tracks about old age and that sort of thing, you're using up almost 5 minutes of your allotted 15 minutes just with that alone. It doesn't feel well paced, is what I'm trying to say. And that is a subjective thing, and a lot of people look past it, and good for you if you can. I've gotten better about it over time, but admittedly, it's still one of the reasons why Bookends doesn't quite work with me and for me on a song-by-song level. Now, the second side, no notes, really. Apart from like Punky's Dilemma, which I think is really good, but is not a favorite of mine, I think everything here is fantastic. Fakin' It is awesome. Mrs. Robinson, just a great breezy track with some brilliant harmonies. I think Art in particular has some great high harmonies on that track. Hazy Shade of Winter and At the Zoo is the closer. I think just a superb batch on the second side. And if I was convinced that the first side had that consistent level of quality, then yeah, this is a lot higher in my ranking, I suppose. Maybe not my number one, but definitely I think a spot or two higher. But overall, I struggle, and it might just be a me thing, I struggle with the pacing of this record a little bit. And so even though a lot of these songs are genuinely fantastic, and it feels very much like an evolution from what they were doing on the two 1966 records, it doesn't quite work for me in as satisfying of a way, at least as a full listen. So Bookends is my number 4 Simon and Garfunkel record. It's still great, still really, really, really good. Just a couple records that I prefer a little bit more from a consistency and from a sequencing standpoint. At number 3, I have 1966's Sounds of Silence, the band's second record, and again, their first release that they put out after The Sound of Silence, the electric version, as it were, became this massive hit. And the thing about Sounds of Silence is, to me, again, this speaks to my opinion on the title track here. I think it starts with possibly the record's weakest moment, in just that I feel like the electric version of the title track is a bit sloppily arranged, and it sticks out kind of like a sore thumb for me. But if you look past that, if you look past my own dissatisfaction, none of the other tracks on this record, including the other electric tracks, none of them have that same problem. In part, that's because, again, the Sound of Silence thing was just kind of a half-assed overdub type of thing, whereas everything else was intentionally written for some sort of electric instrumentation. It sounds a bit more natural. And I think it works really, really well. I think the most notable thing here is now all of a sudden Paul Simon is writing pretty much all the songs, with the exception of the instrumental track on here, Angie. He writes everything else. And it's evident how much better he continues to get as a songwriter in this era. A lot of these are tracks that he was writing or maybe had already started but finished while he was living in England for a while. And many of them are included on his sort of demos album, the Paul Simon Songbook that he put out in 65. But yeah, really sharp stuff. Kathy's song, beautiful, beautiful song. One of his most just kind of heart-wrenching pieces in a lot of ways. Just a beautiful, lovely, lovely, sincere track that I love quite a bit. I am very partial to Somewhere They Can't Find Me. I love how that is, a repackaging of the title track from the previous record with a new chorus added on, and then they're interpolating the guitar line from Angie, the Davy Graham track. And a lot of people were doing that at that time. Angie was a track that a lot of people were covering and recording in acoustic form. But I think it's cool how Paul Simon turns this into a vocal song here and then proceeds to include a cover of Angie directly afterwards just to show where that inspiration came from. I think it's really cool, and I think it's a nice little way of paying homage. Richard Cory, really love that song. Just this kind of acerbic, satirical bent to it. I love the kind of I think it's like a minor seventh chord or something like that they play at the starts of each of the lines and things like that. It's really, really cool. April Come She Will, one of Art Garfunkel's best vocal performances. Just a beautiful, again, simple track. Simon and Garfunkel do simplicity very well, even when it is a solo vocal performance and you don't have the trademark harmonies. Simon and Garfunkel, as isolated singers, really work. They really convey a nice sense of innocence in their voice, certainly in this era, while still having some level of like dynamism as well. And yeah, April Come She Will is a very tranquil track. I Am a Rock, closing the record, one of the most famous Simon and Garfunkel songs, and for good reason. I think it's a very, again, it shows off Paul Simon's introspective side, maybe taking a page out of Brian Wilson's playbook, I suppose, if you will, in how it is introspective, but it is also, I suppose, not satisfied either. It's a very, it's kind of an unhappy track. It's a very defiant, fingers in your ears type of track, but also with, I think, a self-aware narrator as well. It's just a really interesting perspective that Simon plays with that I love. So lots of really, really strong songs. Lots of my favorite Simon and Garfunkel songs are on this record. I think the only reason why it doesn't quite get knocked up a little bit more is because I think maybe you could argue sequencing-wise, flow-wise, it's a little bit less thought through than the two records that I have above it. This is a little bit more of a rush job of an album, so it kind of makes sense. But still incredibly strong. Still an incredibly strong early example of folk rock music. And remarkably influential. I probably would not exaggerate when I say this record is probably Simon and Garfunkel's most influential album, all things considered. And it's very easy to see why. Sounds of Silence, my number 3 Simon and Garfunkel record. At number 2, I have 1966's Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme. So the thing is, like, when I look at the track listings of both of the 1966 records, I'm a little bit more inclined to say Sounds of Silence is actually better on a track-for-track basis, or at least it has more of my personal favorite Simon and Garfunkel tracks. But I think where Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme wins out for me a little bit is sequencing. I keep coming back to that, but I think really that is, at least in this band's case, really a defining factor and a huge deciding factor in me trying to sort out these rankings, because all these albums I love quite a bit. The opening track, I mean, I could go on for ages and ages talking about how much I love Scarborough Fair and Canticle. The interpolation of the traditional English folk song with Paul Simon's track, The Side of a Hill, is stunning, possibly my favorite just harmonies or like favorite vocal production of their whole career. And that's one thing that stands out to me as well on this album is the sound of it. It sounds, massive at points. There's a nice little bit of echo on their voices in some of the softer tracks that give this thing a little bit more of like a haunting, reverberant quality that I like quite a bit. And that is so present on Scarborough Fair. I love the multiple interweaving vocal lines. There's so much counterpoint going on here that is really cool. And again, the interpolation of songs is going to come back on the closing track as well, which we'll get to. But there is consistently that sense of melancholy, I think, throughout this record. Even in the tracks that seem a little bit lighter, like Homeward Bound and the 59th Street Bridge song, they feel lightweight, and certainly the 59th Street Bridge song does. They're lightweight tracks, and they're meant to be fun, but they don't feel like ebullient ever to me. They don't ever, like, you can listen to 60s pop music and even 60s folk music from this era, and you can hear some tracks that are just full of joy and just full of exuberance and that sort of thing. And this record is always reserved. It always kind of holds itself back. So in a way, like, you can pair something like Feeling Groovy with a more kind of melancholy track as well. Like, I don't know, maybe Flowers Never Been with the Rainfall, or For Emily, Whenever I May Find Her. It always kind of comes back to something a little bit more somber and a little bit more real. And I think that mixture here of different moods and different vibes makes this a fascinating record to me. Again, I do think that this still shows off some of the humorous side of his writing. Paul Simon's A Simple Desultory Philippic is clearly a Bob Dylan send-up. And it's, I'm not really, generally speaking, that partial to Bob Dylan's sort of satire tracks from this era. I talked about it a little bit on the Kingston Trio video that I did a while back. There's a Kingston Trio track that tries to do that, and I think it's god-awful, frankly. But this works. This one works. I think there's a charm to it. And again, a little bit of a self-awareness there that I like a good bit. I talked about Homeward Bound. I enjoy that quite a bit. The Dangling Conversation is a track where I think you get to hear both sides of Paul Simon's writing, both the sort of self-serious side and the humorous side, kind of all in one track. And the result is really beautiful. One of my favorite songs on the record for sure. For Emily, Whenever I May Find Her, possibly a controversial take. This might be my favorite just Art Garfunkel vocal. I know something like Bridge Over Troubled Water is more dynamic, but I think his performance on this song is just absolutely restrained in the perfect way. And then he kind of lets loose with that final stanza that is just, it gives me goosebumps every time I hear it. It's one of the Simon and Garfunkel tracks that consistently, I think, gets me the most in that kind of special sort of way. And I adore it. I love it so much. And then the closing track, 7 O'Clock News, Silent Night. I think there may be some mixed thoughts on this track in hindsight. Maybe people feeling that it's a little bit heavy-handed or maybe even a little bit corny. I think it's powerful. I think it's a super effective closing statement to this record. And again, going back to that dichotomy, that kind of clash of joy with these kind of wintry Christmas themes of Silent Night with the, kind of news report that they have going on in the background. There was a re-recording of this from a few years ago, a cover of this by Fiona Apple, Phoebe Bridgers, and Matt Berninger from The National, where Apple and Bridgers were singing the parts and Berninger was the news reporter. And that came out, 2020, 2021, something like that. And really, that's the type of approach that is just so prescient, so timeless that you could apply it to a lot of different eras, but it does translate very well to both the 1960s and the 2020s in particular, I think. We'll put it that way. And I think in taking this approach, this feels to me like Paul Simon in a way almost predicting the futility of the hippie movement in a way. This idea that, hey, like, no matter what we think we can do as musicians and as artists to inspire change and to inspire joy, when push comes to shove, ultimately the world is kind of a pile of shit when all is said and done, and the bad things are still going to happen. And that's a depressing note to end a record on, and maybe not what he was intending entirely, but I think, again, it speaks to the fascination of this thing. I think as a thematic idea, even if this is not a concept record per se, I think it works for me a little bit more effectively, a lot more effectively, honestly, than Bookends does. And in that sense, I adore this album. It actually has been my favorite Simon & Garfunkel record at points in the past. But today it comes in at number 2. But again, superb. I would genuinely say one of the best records of 1966, which is saying a lot knowing what other records came out that year. And highly worth exploring and checking out if you haven't before. And at number 1, I have 1970's Bridge Over Troubled Water, the final record by the duo. Not a very surprising number 1 pick, I don't think, just because, again, going back to the intro, when I talked about, how in many ways the appeal of Simon & Garfunkel that has transcended the years, transcended the eras, a lot of it, I think, comes down to how much it feels like lightning in a bottle and how much they literally went out on top. And they very much did so with this record. In some ways, the most ambitious thing that they've ever done as a full-length project. Maybe not the most abstract thing. Again, I still think the Bookends concept as an idea is more abstract than what they're doing here. But this record covers a lot of sonic ground. It sounds like they took the opening bits of the Bookends record and sort of stretch it out over a full-length album while maybe toning down some of the quote-unquote weirder qualities, but really just, I don't know, it's like Paul Simon got hit with some sort of muse, some sort of divine inspiration. If he hadn't been already, he got hit with another fucking wave of it for this album, I suppose. Because he is just churning out some of the best songs you will ever hear anybody write. And he, as far as I'm concerned, some of the best tracks from this era, period, are on this record. I swear Paul Simon has 3, if not 4 of the best songs of the late 60s, early 70s, just on this one record. That's how high of a level he was operating at this point in history. And so many of them almost don't really need explanation as far as why they're great. The title track, it's great because of the arrangement, the very, very much kind of, Phil Spector approach to bombastic production and massive echo and things like that. Just a huge song, and choosing Art to sing the track is the perfect choice and an inspired choice. You don't hear him belt out as much as he does on this track very frequently across his whole career, really. But he nails this performance in every possible sense. Cecilia, great upbeat track. Admittedly, not one of my favorites on the album, but just, again, true joy. This is what I mean by the ebullient joy that I don't think is there on Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme. It's there on Cecilia. It's absolutely there. And then The Boxer, just this magnificent, magnificent song with some of Paul Simon's most introspective and evocative lyrics. It's an interesting song structurally, I think, as it kind of just slowly builds up, never really gets going, and then that whole sweeping outro is amazing. Just with the different vocal parts, you have that really high Art falsetto, and then there's that low bass part from Paul just coming in subtly to echo over everything, and you have that snare drum shot with the massive kind of echo going on. I mean, just, it's a phenomenally arranged song, phenomenally written song. It does everything well. And then you have some of the more kind of intimate tracks. El Condor Pasa is probably the only real precedent we have for what Paul Simon will do in his solo career, really starting to experiment with exploring music from other cultures and that sort of thing. You get a little bit of that here, and it's a really charming song, really beautiful song. Love how Paul and Art again kind of trade off the vocals at different points. Keep the Customer Satisfied is excellent. So Long, Frank Lloyd Wright, another kind of underrated Art vocal performance there. Baby Driver, a lot of fun. Again, some great just kind of 3-4 part harmony stuff going on. Just another really silly track and really fun. The Only Living Boy in New York is possibly my favorite song on the record as of now. Perhaps only because I wouldn't necessarily say it is a for sure better song than the title track or the Boxer or what have you, just in the sense that this is not a track that I've been exposed to as much historically. It's not one that gets played on, radio as frequently and that sort of thing. And it's, for, a record that in a number of ways is making a lot of allusions to endings and separations and things like that. This is the one that confronts it in the face, right? This is the one that confronts a relationship, or in this case, a working creative relationship coming to an end very clearly. And it's moving in an interesting way. And again, very much like the Boxer and the title track, it's the production. It is the building up of layers and layers and the usage of echo that makes this just a captivating song the whole way through. Really excellent. Again, if you have one area where you could probably critique this record, it is sequencing. It is the fact that it probably ends with its weakest stretch of songs. But even then, I think it works in an interesting way. Why Don't You Write Me, I think, is again a little bit of in hindsight anyways, a little bit of a teaser towards what Simon will explore more frequently in even his debut solo record. I mean, the beats and the rhythmic patterns here are a little bit proto mother and child reunion, I suppose. The Bye Bye Love cover, awkward to have a live song in there, but again, I think it's very much playing off of their influences, paying tribute to their influences. In that sense, I think it works in that sense. It works as kind of an emotionally, wrapping up the final chapter of their story, an emotionally poignant moment. And then Song for the Asking as a closing track, I think, is just a nice little coda, nice little epilogue from Simon himself. And that's what you get. And I talked about every single song because I think every song plays an important part in telling this sonic story. And this one, I'm not making any pretense about Bridge Over Troubled Water being a concept album. I think there are some themes that appear in various different songs, but I don't think there's a connective tissue, really. But I do think sonically it feels extremely cathartic. And with the finality that is associated with it, because it is Simon and Garfunkel's last record, I think that catharsis can easily be applied to their story as well. And that's part of why this record hits, almost by chance. The songs are that good. The production is that excellent, transcendent. The vocals are very strong. Core songwriting is great. There's so much that goes well on this record. So much that is, two people, again, very much operating at the top of their craft, even in the midst of a lot of strife, interpersonal strife between the two of them, and creative strife, trying to figure out, where do we go next if we're not going to be making music together, that sort of thing. So it's a fantastic album. Not much more to be said about it. It is considered to be one of the best records of all time, honestly, for a reason. And I adore it. And I probably have never loved it as much as I do now. So there is that piece as well. Bridge Over Troubled Water by Simon and Garfunkel, my number one record by the duo. All right, and that is it. So let me know in the comments below what your favorite Simon and Garfunkel record is, what your favorite Simon and Garfunkel songs are. For only having 5 albums, the depth of their catalog is absolutely bonkers. So many terrific bits of songwriting and execution and everything else. So check everything out. Let me know what you think. With that, thanks a lot for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more videos and discography rankings are to come. I mentioned this is going to be the first part of a 3-part series. This will drop on Monday. Art Garfunkel solo albums will drop on Wednesday. Paul Simon solo albums will close us out on Friday. So stay tuned and look forward to that. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Spreading the word really helps out, so I really appreciate your help and your attention to that. Thanks a lot, and I will see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.